everybody back. So we'll be recording the session. And for our Canadians here today, happy Canada Day. Thank you for coming on what is a national holiday for you. So welcome back. And we thought we would start off this afternoon or morning, wherever you are, doing a check-in. Any ahas above and below the line. And what we thought you would do is we would ask you to play on the slide here. If you remember, you go up to view option and click on annotate. Pick your favorite color. So when you click on annotate, you can pick your favorite color, 12 or 14 point. And if you would just take a few minutes and share any ahas, maybe you can type the mostly above the line, below the line, sitting on the line. Was there a favorite conversations worth having story that resonated with you? But we're just doing a check-in on your body mindset right now. Somebody drew a line. So you can click on text. You know, how are you feeling? Okay, great. I'll move things around. Somebody just drew above the line. We got some above the lines, feeling great and happy. I'm gonna say that was happy or happy life insurance. The do-over was powerful. Somebody had a do-over conversation. Someone's below the line, but working on it. Great. And if you get really comfortable and you typed in a text, you can always stamp something and grab a symbol. There's a stamp. There's a stamp. And we're just doing a quick check-in with all of us, thinking about the concept as I go through about my day. Awesome. And if you type over each other, I've got power to move you around. Intentionally paying attention. Thinking protect versus connect. Common language. Wonderful.
I'd love to hear from whoever typed in, I started below the line, and holding for, but moved above the line and holding for outcomes. I'm curious as to if you're willing to share, how did you move? What did you do? What did you think, say? How did you act? How did you move above the line?
So you can unmute yourself. It's Suzette, right? She's waving away.
Oh, am I on?
You are.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'm on a homeowners board, and we were trying to decide if we were going to open the pool, and the board is very conservative, and they sent out an email, we're not opening up the pool. And I knew that there was going to be some backlash in the community, and I also knew that the board members, like I said, were very conservative. So what I did was I was very upset, and social media was getting a hold of the situation. So I tried to reframe or reflip it. I tried to use my techniques, but not knowing that I was using my techniques. And I presented the board with some questions to say, what could we do? How could we give access to the community for the pool? And they were like, what? I thought it was just like open or not open. And so that's why I said, I went from down to above to say, hey, you know, just by asking a question or having them ponder, now we can have a secondary conversation this evening about if we open the pool in some capacity, maybe for laps or whatever, what would that look like? So
Very cool.
So that is asking a generative question, which will be the topic of today. And Suzette has joined us, for the last 8 Kickstarters that we were doing on Mondays that we will resume in the fall again. So I'm going to teach you one more thing. It's really scary when I get to teach something with Zoom. But if you look at your toolbar and you hit on the save, this whiteboard with all of the design on it will automatically save in your document file, and you'll have a picture of what you guys drew. And if you don't do that, I promise to email this lovely picture to you sometime within the next 24 hours. So we just wanted to do a quick check-in. So I'm going to clear all the drawings. If you want to take a moment, you can save it on the toolbar. And while I'm cleaning up this, Sherry, do you want to just tell them briefly what the Kickstarters were? We did this for 8 weeks and we'll resume it in the fall.
Sure. We met for 30 minutes every Monday at noon Eastern time, and people just were able to bring whatever kind of an issue, topic, problem, something that they were stuck on, and then together as a group we used the whiteboard and people came up with generative questions for how might we shift the tone and direction of that conversation so that we could make it one worth having.
Okay, so we want to welcome you back, and we're going to talk about generative questions today. And if you're following along in your workbook, you can flip over to page 16. And I see some of you are still you're loving me, you're still putting hearts. So I got to just take a second and clear your drawings on my beautiful slides here. All right. And if you're following along in the workbook, we are on page 16. And today we're going to go into generative questions. And to give you a little background, so the two practices, this module will be generative questions, the next one will be positive framing. When Sherry and I wrote this book, and our hopes and dreams was to get appreciative inquiry out to the general public and something that was non-academic and telling stories. And we really learned after 25 years of doing it is conversations are how we interact. It's the best way to, we'll talk a little bit about appreciative inquiry today, but I want you to think of appreciative inquiry as an operating system in your body and in your mind, and it's how you think and what you say. It's a philosophy. And our editor said he would prefer one practice, but we switched in two, and it was generative questions and positive framing. And for those of you that have the book Conversations Worth Having, if you look on page 46, we talk about these work together, these two practices. And if you start off with generative questions, you will see how it naturally, and thank you, Suzette, for your example, creates a positive frame. And it doesn't matter which one you start with, but a generative question will result in a positive frame. And sometimes you will have time, and we'll do this in module 3, that you have time to think about how you want to frame a conversation, and that you will build in the generative questions. Okay. So I'd like you to write in the chat box, what percentage of your waking life, when you're awake, are you spending in conversations in your mind and with others? So as you're awake throughout your day, what percentage of your waking life is spent in conversations? Now I'm controlling the slide, so I might ask Sherry to read out some of the percentages that she's singing. She's muted, so.
90, 50, 85, 65, 96, 90, 80 to 85, 90, 90. Depends. Is email a conversation? That's great.
Yeah.
97, 90, 90%.
Yes. And we get anywhere from 95 to 99% of your waking moment is spent in conversations. And if you look at the Conversations We're Having book, we say that conversations is a crucial part of everything that we do, and it's how we interact with ourselves and with others. Now, if you're looking at this diagram here, I want you to think of conversations are like the water in which fish swim. Fish don't even realize they're in the water until you go fishing and try to take one out of water. The water is always there for these fish. And conversations are always there for you. And conversations influence everything for you. And if the water becomes toxic, let's get back to these fish, the fish can't thrive anymore. And if your conversations are critical or destructive and toxic, you are definitely not thriving anymore. So that's the importance of conversations, is pretty much how we breathe and go through our days. whether it's in your mind and with others and texting and emailing. So if you have your workbook in front of you, and you can flip over to page 17, we're going to try an exercise. I'm just going to talk you through this, some reflection. And if you don't have your workbook in front of you, just go back to page 17 later. But I want to share with you these 4 quadrants, and we talk about these 4 quadrants in chapter 2 of our book. And then we're going to talk about where you spend your time. But imagine that you're either above the line appreciative or below the line appreciative. And that's one part of the quadrant of a conversation. And your conversations can be statement-based. I say something, a statement to you, and you give a statement back to me. And there's no inquiry going on. Or they can be inquiry-based. That's the other part. And a conversation, if I just tell you your work is sloppy, you're never going to amount to anything, you're not going to get promoted, that's a really destructive conversation. You're negative, I'm negative, we go nowhere. And we advocate that you want to spend like 0% of the time here. You may find yourself in a destructive, but these are not good for you. And then if you move over, we've probably all been part on the receiving end, or we've been in a critical conversation when you, without thinking, say, what were you ever thinking? Why did you do it that way? And critical conversations are only good to a point, and that point better be that you realize all you're doing is asking critical questions to the person, and they're going to shut down. And they're going to, in their mind, they're going to not listen to you anymore. They're not going to be able to handle any feedback, anything you say, because every question puts them in a protect mode. So we have all, I know with my kids, I have found myself in a critical conversation. And through what we're teaching you here, you can learn how to shift your way up into a conversation worth having. So now there's the 3rd quadrant. And that's where I tell you, great, I love the way you presented the data. And you might make a statement saying, I'm glad you're glad, Jackie. I'm glad we're on the same page. And I said, yeah, that's just wonderful. It's affirmative. I make you feel good. You might make me feel good. It's affirming. But there's no questions involved. So we don't know, what is it you really did well? How is it that you can keep on improving? You know, and again, affirmative conversation, like, a critical conversation is good to a point. The other example we have here is, you know, I prefer option B because it gives me more flexibility. And then you advocate for option C, and then someone advocates for option D. What we really want you to do and learn here is to spend 80% of the time in conversations worth having. And that's learning to appreciate the person, hear the person, adding value, valuing the situation, and then the inquiry. And here's a question in the conversations worth having. What ideas do you have for making this work for everyone? And if you have the book with you, we talk about this in the science and the 4-to-1, that, you know, you can't live here 100% of the time. We're asking for about 80% of the time to be living here in that quadrant. So if you take a look at your workbook on page 17, I would just like you to think about the last week and look at the lines in the quadrant and reflect on the conversations over the week. And what I like to do is sometimes assign percentages. Where did you find yourself? What percentage of time? Were you 20% affirmative conversations, just statements back and forth, advocacy? Did you slip into a critical conversation? And did you have a destructive conversation? And I have to tell you, over the years, as Sherry and I have worked with these quadrants, and there's sometimes a destructive conversation is when I am talking to a colleague about somebody who's not there, and I begin to put that person down or that situation down. And that's not good. And then you put that person down, and I put that, and that can lead to a very destructive conversation of a person who's not even in there. So just recall your conversations over the last week. And you see that there's lines in there, so you can either write in affirmative conversations, but just think of types of conversations you're having with others. And also, where are the conversations you're having in your head? If you looked at yourself, what types of conversations are you having in your mind? So, go back to page 17, do a little reflection, and our goal is to put you 80% of the time into a conversation worth having. So Sherry, I want to kind of hand it over to you to talk about full conversations. And if you're in your workbook, we're on page 18 now.
So whenever you're in a conversation, regardless of what the nature of the conversation is, there's always more going on than your words, as we all know. But it's surprising how small the percentage of meaning comes from the verbal language. Only 7% contributes to the meaning that the person is making of what you are saying. Your voice, the tone, the tenor of your voice, and your body language are also really important. And if there's an incongruence, so for example, if you're trying to be above the line, but you actually are below the line and you're feeling either defensive or critical and judgmental, then what's going to happen is your words may be above the line. You may be asking a question, a generative question, but there may be some agenda to it, or there's going to be a tone in your voice, or your body language or facial expression doesn't match. And what the research says is that sends a confusing message, and then people are going to pay attention to the body language and the tone more than they are your words. So it's part of the reason why it's so important to be congruent between where you are above or below the line, as well as with the words that you're saying. Go to the next slide, Jackie. Thanks. And so one of the things we want to talk about is listening as the silent partner of a conversation worth having. And in debate, we're listening to form our next argument. What's the point? We're listening for what's wrong with what the other person is saying so that we can attack the idea and put our idea forward. In a discussion, we're often listening for a break in the conversation where we can add our point of view, or we'll listen and hear the other person and then interject our point of view into that. Back up just for a second, Jackie. But dialogue is very different. Dialogue is that idea of speaking and then the other person really listening and asking questions in order to deepen their understanding. And it deepens the understanding of the person listening, but also often deepens the understanding of the person who's speaking. Because when you ask a person to say more about something, or you ask, so how did you come to think that way? That person often begins to discover things about themselves that they didn't know. And this is part of being a generative question. Okay, next one. So this is the Chinese symbol for listening. And what we encourage people to do in a conversation worth having is listen the way the Chinese suggest real listening is. So to listen includes both ears, but also eyes, undivided attention, and heart. So you're listening with an open heart, you're listening with an open mind, and you're listening with an open will, not downloading what you're going to say next or anything. So there are a couple of ways you can prepare for deep listening. One of them is to do an emotional audit, and this does not take very long. If you're engaged in a really important conversation, take just a minute to prepare yourself for it. Ask yourself, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? And do I want a particular thing to happen? Because if I want something to happen in the conversation, I'm going to be listening from that perspective. And then to ask yourself, how might I be getting in my way? And what am I going to do next? And what you're really looking to do is get into that space, again, of open mind, open heart, open will, and centering yourself. And then really bringing yourself fully present. And again, it's take a deep breath and you can lengthen. So take your breath so you lengthen upwards and exhale so that you ground yourself. And then just get a sense. You can lean forward and back or slightly to the left and the right so that you get a sense of putting yourself in the center of your own space. And then as you get a sense of gravity by placing the attention on your shoulders and on the weight of your jaw, you'll find it relaxes you. And then just simply ask yourself, what would it be like if there was a little more and whatever comes up? So a little more calm, a little more centeredness, a little more openness. And so that begins the ability to really engage in a conversation worth having, which is a blend of that deep listening plus inquiry and advocacy, so that you really end up having a conversation that broadens and deepens and moves you towards where you're wanting to go. And you know when you're in a conversation worth having. Last week, everybody was able to easily recall a conversation that was a negative conversation and a conversation that was a great one, that was energizing. So we know when they're there. And if we were asked about it, we would say there's a positive tone, engagement, and these are some of the words you used last week. The question is, how can we be intentional? How do we become aware of the water we're swimming in and make sure that it's intentionally healthy and moving us towards where we want to go?
Okay, so what we're going to just talk to you about just for a few minutes is a little bit about appreciative inquiry. What I want to do is any of you registered for one or two centers, either the David L. Cooper Writer Center for Appreciative Inquiry or the Center for Appreciative Inquiry in Las Vegas, Nevada. These centers offer intro to AI workshops. Sherry does a certification training in appreciative inquiry, and so you can go as deep as you want to go. Last night, we sent out an article and a book chapter, and the article, if anything, if you should really read the article, AI is not just about the positive, because people who don't understand appreciative inquiry will say, well, it's just about being positive. And we spent a lot of time with the word questions and generative questions, and that article was really instrumental in calling it generative questions, and not in the old days, 35 years ago, it was called the unconditional positive question. And then we sent you a book chapter if you want to dive deeper into appreciative inquiry and understand that it's made up of these 5 principles and that there's this 4D cycle. You can go as deep and far as you want. The picture of the Cleveland Clinic here is how appreciative inquiry was really born. And it was working with the Cleveland Clinic when they realized they wanted to create a more egalitarian organization. And how could we get the people in the systems, the nurses, the doctors, the staff, engaging in what could build a healthier organization? And you can boil the definition of AI is the importance of appreciative, to add value and value people in the best of what is. And in the earlier readings, Ron Fry, who was one of the co-creators, would say, it's really about the question. If you can ask questions that are showing curiosity in the search for what generates life-giving systems and emergence, the questions are at the heart of what we can do. So appreciative inquiry is 35 years old. Sherry and I were introduced to it about 25 years ago. And it really just started out as a research technique, and now you see it everywhere in organizational life and communities. This is just a picture of we just threw out logos of organizations that we thought you might be familiar with that have used appreciative inquiry. In the work here from Facebook, Green Mountain, you know, that lots of organizations are beginning to use appreciative, these are organizations that have been using appreciative inquiry. So we want to focus in on the two simple practices, generative questions and positive framing, to make a conversation worth having. And so today the focus will be on generative questions. And generative questions change the way people think, and they stimulate compelling images for people to act on. And earlier, Sherry talked about generative questions that you can ask of the self when you're in a situation. And especially if you feel yourself below the line and you need to get up above the line. But in a situation, ask yourself, what assumptions am I making? What else might explain what happened? What was I anticipating? How might that influence my perception? Generative questions will put you into, it will put you into a positive mindset, but really a growth and a learning mindset. And what we're going to do is we're going to practice in a few minutes generative questions. But this is a typical example we put on the slide. When's the last time you've been in a hallway? You have to go back and imagine 110 days ago. But you know, Sam just walked past me in the hallway and didn't even acknowledge me when I said hello. That's the situation. We've been there. And sometimes you have a reaction, well, you know, he's such a jerk, or I never liked him, or he's not paying attention to me. And, you know, we would ask you to, you know, step back for a moment and ask some questions such as, did Sam even hear me? I wonder what was distracting Sam. Should I follow up with Sam? And think about the last 90 days in your quarantine. Have you sent a text? Or did you send an email and somebody didn't respond to you? I'm very guilty of accidentally deleting emails without even knowing it. And you might ask yourself, maybe they didn't get the email. Maybe they accidentally deleted it. You know, but these are asking yourself generative questions. Sherry, do you want to finish up here?
Sure. So generative questions, in addition to questions you might ask yourself, generative questions can be used to shift a conversation that somebody else is in that is a negative conversation, or one that seems to be spiraling around the problem and spiraling down. Generative questions to shift conversations are things like, what's happening here? Or how can I support you? What might be possible now? Or even what's one small action that would make a difference? When you're asking a generative question to intervene in what seems like a negative or problem-focused conversation, the idea isn't to solve the problem for the people that are in it. It's really easy to start asking questions where you might have an agenda behind it. Have you thought about this? The idea instead is to shift the dynamic of the conversation, to bring it above the line. So to ask a question that shifts the way the people in the conversation are thinking themselves. Can we go to the next slide? So you're looking really to add value. It doesn't mean that your question is always going to be what somebody might say would be a positive question, but it is a question that adds value. For example, if someone comes to you really upset about something, to try to immediately ask a question and shift it onto something positive is likely to make the person feel like they haven't been seen, they haven't been heard, they're being dismissed. So asking a question about, even asking them, can you tell me a little bit more about what's happened? Or how is that impacting you? You want to deepen and allow the person to be heard before you begin to ask questions that may begin to shift where they are. So questions that build a connection and develop shared understanding don't always sound positive, but they actually add value to the conversation. Sometimes making the invisible visible. So what did you assume there? Or what unspoken rules are we paying attention to that we may not have to pay attention to? Identifying strengths, best practices, those are really common appreciative inquiry questions. Generating new knowledge, especially if everybody is in that deep listening space of open mind, open heart, open will. It's like, what do we don't know? What's possible that's never been possible before? What do we want to do? Where are we going together? That shared outcome. And how might we innovate together? Next slide.
Yeah, Sherry, can I take a question from Martha? She just asked a very good question.
Absolutely.
Martha, can you say what you just said in the chat and give some context to Sherry? Maybe we're doing really great on timing and we can talk about your question.
Sure. So I'm sure many people on this call, am a supervisor. And there are times when I have to ask questions like, did y'all notice this? Or can you tell me more about this? But that's usually because either I see a problem or somebody above me or next to me has seen a problem. And so I'm asking the question to see, I really am asking, did you notice this? Can you tell me about it? But there is no way that I do not have an agenda, which is going to be, now y'all are going to fix this.
So I think you raise a great point, because first of all, pointing out when there is a problem adds value. It's not about glossing over problems or issues that need to be addressed. It's once they have been pointed out, how are we going to go about fixing this? And so asking the questions in such a way, I can hear in the tone when you first said, did y'all notice this? With that tone, that might put people on the defensive. But you could say the same thing with a, did anyone notice this? We care about the health and safety of you and your loved ones. Somebody might want to mute themselves. Using non-essential travel, we are offering telemedicine.
Yes, whoever's doing non-essential travel.
Telemedicine in the background.
Right. I was like, what? It's just happened.
And so it is, and this is, I think this is a great topic for us being able to come back to when we get to positive framing next week, because if a problem's been pointed out, you can think through before you bring it up with everybody else, how am I going to frame this in a way that we can have a positive, generative conversation without people going on the defensive.
All right, thank you.
Can I respond?
Absolutely, please.
So I hear what you're saying, and I would love to believe that's possible, but there are times, so I work in higher ed, which is a really interesting industry right now. I see you smiling, there, like right now, I would love to be able to have generative conversations, but we are at a point where we have to do what we are being told to do. We don't get to have a lot of creative input about the direction we're going. And sometimes we don't get creative input about how we're going to get there.
Right. So you may not have a say in where you're going, and you might be able to have a creative conversation amongst yourself about how are we going to go here in a way that we feel safe, or we feel that we're able to do our jobs well, or whatever the issue is, the thing that you feel is that maybe you shouldn't be going in this direction, but you don't have a choice. So if you could go in that direction and feel better about it, what would be happening? how can we make this make the best out of what's going on here? Or how do we even go where we're supposed to go, but do it in such an innovative way that now we really want to go there?
And Martha, this is Jackie, and when I send it to Martha, I'm going to send it to all of you. I'm going to send you a 500-word blog that I wrote about in my higher education system about the issue you're talking about and the types of generative questions we've asked as faculty pushing back in a generative way. And I'll send it to all of you today to help you, no matter who has to go back to the thing that you have to do. Okay? All right, Sherry.
So just one other thing in response to that, Martha, sometimes it's of value to say, here's what's going on for me, and just put that out there and have the conversation. Is anybody else feeling this way? And how might we work together so that we can, don't have to say move above the line, but that we can actually move forward together. So making that background foreground can be very important.
Okay.
Hey, Sherry, could I interject? Would
Absolutely.
that be all right? Are we okay on time?
Yeah,
Sure.
we're good on time, everybody.
We're good.
I just wanted to share with Martha and everyone. So my work is in the area of child welfare, and I'm the person that the state often calls in when there have been child fatalities and that counties have to respond with their system to lack of management of a serious crisis situation. And what I would suggest to all of us is to recognize that the framework suggested takes a lot of practice. That's been pointed out a number of times in the chat. And today, it'll be pointed out a number of times over the coming days and weeks together for those of you who will come back for the second half of the boot camp. And I would suggest that, I didn't start practicing generative questions in meetings, in the aftermath of a fatality. I started them with my own family. But now I'm able to utilize the skills regardless of the situation in the high stress environments. And so I hope that you all will start perhaps in safe places. And then as you build your skills, you transition into using these, in those high stakes situations like Martha's talking about, when, something's got to happen now and it feels urgent. And, maybe no one really cares about my input and my desire to try to be, sensitive and trauma informed or whatever the case may be, that we start small and we develop and we get that practice in. So thanks for the moment to share, Sherry.
Yeah, great. Thank you for adding, Michael.
We have one more question, Sherry, and then I think we can move on. Liz asked, is there a link between what you have control over and the appropriateness of generative questions?
That's a great question. And it's a question that I've never thought about before. I would guess, yes, that there would be a link about the type of question you might ask because of the context. That might be a good conversation point when we break into small groups, or to carry forward and think about over the next week so that we can start there next week by opening up and having that as a point of conversation. That's a great question.
And you'll see Terry typed in, I think generative questions are always appropriate, but you might not get the answer you're looking for. And you will start to develop a reputation. I've been on sabbatical this semester and people have said, how would Jackie ask that question? Because I use generative questions. It's just who I am now. It will be who you are. The more you begin to understand it, that's just how you're going to learn to ask questions. So thank you. All right, Sherry, we can move forward now.
And just one other point there is, Rob asked way back up in the chat box to say a little bit more about advocacy. And advocacy is simply not necessarily arguing, but advocating for a particular point of view, a particular choice, an approach to something. It's you're making the case for why this is what we should choose to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so a couple of practicing, and then we're going to get into small groups, and you're going to practice in small groups. So first, are we breaking straight into small groups?
Yeah, let's practicing priming your own mindset.
So
We're going to break into the groups.
yeah, just you'll get into groups. Imagine you're a manager and an employee has failed to turn in a report on time, and now you're facing a meeting tomorrow and you have no data. So the idea with these is in your groups, you're going to have different kinds of scenarios, and it's what are you primed for? What how do you ask yourself some questions to shift above the line? And then what kinds of questions might you ask to move forward? So we are going to move into small groups. And these will all come up in those small groups. Any questions before we do? You'll be in your small groups for about 10 minutes. And then we'll come back into the large group.
Sherry, for the breakout groups, I seem to lost my ability to share. So if I can get in a group with maybe someone else, that would really be helpful.
Okay.
I don't have the slide.
All right, let me move here.
Maybe partner up with Lisa or whoever's staying in the main one here.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Would you want to just stay in here with Lisa?
That's fine.
Okay, and I will pop over to.
Hey, Tony, did the slides change from a week ago? They didn't change. It starts with Sarah, right?
That's the one that I have. And
okay.
Yes,
I just can't share
okay.
it.
Starts with Sarah.
Yeah, I can do it. I'm happy to
Okay.
share. I want to make sure.
And then as you're getting started, it's like, nope, we're going to need it. Good morning, Sherry.
Good morning. Sorry, I was fixing something in the main room with people. How are you all?
Doing well.
Good. I'm going to share my screen so that we can start working on the examples. Okay. Okay. So let's practice priming your mindset. Sarah is routinely late for the early Wednesday meeting. What are you primed for when yet again you're at the meeting, Sarah shows up late?
The expectation is Sarah is going to be late for the meeting because Sarah's priorities is not your priorities.
Yeah, so we're primed to already be making assessments about why Sarah's always late. Anybody else primed for anything in addition to that?
You know, I'm sorry, I was going to say I'm primed for. I know that I have some staff, and in fact, I have a niece. Their inner clock works very differently than mine does. I have a husband whose inner clock works differently than mine does. And through 19 years of marriage, we have learned to respect each other's clocks, so to speak. And so because of those experiences, I'm going to be a little more primed to have a conversation with Sarah with that assumption that our clock works differently, and how do we make it work for both of us? Because I'm not going to change a clock. I don't have the right to try to do that.
Right. So assuming her clock works differently. Okay. Anybody else have an assumption, or what are they primed primed for?
Well, actually, I like Jean's response, but I would have never thought about it in terms of the way she actually presented it. We've had a staff person that was always late, and it was about actually having a conversation as to the reason why. And we were able to solve the situation, make them feel better because they didn't want to come to the meeting, but help them to understand the importance of why it was important that they were there to support the team. So it's taking that back seat and looking at the other person's situation is actually pretty damn interesting.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful insight that that
Yeah.
if you check in with what am I primed for? Oh, I'm making some assumptions, and do I really know that they're accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Then leads you to ask with a much more open mind, what's going on for you that you're late every Wednesday morning? And you might find their clock is off, and you can ask the question of how do we make this work for both of us? You might find that Wednesday's the only day of the week Sarah has to drop her child at daycare, and she can't leave the child until 8 o'clock. You know, as you said, Deb, there are so many different possibilities until you ask that question. Great. All right.
But can I ask one question?
Yeah,
though?
sure.
So in situations like this, it is better to ask a question than to start a conversation so that the both of you are on the same page.
Unless you're already both on the same page and you know, because if we start the conversation, unless we're starting the conversation and we have no agenda and no assumptions, but if we start the conversation assuming Sarah doesn't really care about the rest of us, then it's going to be a very different conversation than if we start it, you know, with a question. Or you might start the conversation if it's, you know, it's really important for you to be here on time. What could make that possible?
Okay.
But it's that knowing what's going on for me. What am I primed for? What are my assumptions? Because that's going to come through in either the facial language or the body language. And that's what the other person will react to then. How about this one? We're living in a time that calls for serious conversations about systemic racism and racial equity. For many people, this puts them in a protect mode and they go below the line. What questions might you ask yourself or another to prime for connect? And if you want, we can use this as a whiteboard, and you can use your toolbar to, or we can just have the conversation.
And Sherry, I had difficulty with the whiteboard and toolbar earlier. I was never able to get more than 3 words before I was no longer able to type.
Let's just talk then.
Okay.
That's easier, more engaging anyway.
And do you have a slide we could look at?
Are you not seeing my slides?
I see the one that just says module 2.
That's all we see.
How is that? Huh.
Yeah.
We don't see slide number 6.
That is so curious because it started with number 2, and let me try going back again. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
It says now you try intervening with a question.
Yeah, but we'll need to go back to that's module 3. I'm going in the wrong direction. I am so sorry. Let's go. Hold on. I don't understand why you weren't seeing it. I'm sorry you weren't. I assumed since it was up for me, it was up for you. All right. Share.
There we go.
Great. Okay. Thank you for telling me that. This is what I was seeing before, so I'm not sure why you weren't. Anyway, what questions can you ask yourself or another to prime for connect when talking around systemic racism and racial equality?
I think one of the questions that I would want to ask is, how are my life experiences different than people of other races? I grew up with, middle class parents in Western and then the middle of Nebraska, and there is very, very little diversity in most of Nebraska, but certainly in the Western and Central part. So I know that my life experiences are different. I just don't know how, and I want to know how so that I can understand and be respectful of what those differences are and why I may approach situations differently and how I can do it in a much more respectful way.
Great. What other questions might help you prime yourself or another for connect?
I've recently had to have a lot of these conversations where I work. And one question that I've been asking myself a lot before I have conversations with others around this topic is, what things might I unknowingly be doing that might be contributing to this? And can I bring any of that mindfully in front of myself before I try to connect? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And that has worked.
Any other thoughts or ideas?
Well, we've been having this conversation actually nationally in Canada around Indigenous peoples and the systemic racism they face here in Canada. And some of the key questions that folks have been asking have been, what don't we know? How can we find out what we don't know from all different points of view? Like for me, being in a privileged position that I am in Canada, there's so many things that I don't know. And we've been lucky. We've had a lot of Indigenous folks talk about their life experiences, but it's been hard for them too, because they are the ones with the knowledge of how the white privilege has been affecting them. And for those of us who have the white privilege, to hear it is hurtful but important. So my question to myself always is, how can I listen truly with an open mind without judging or without being taking this on as a personal, some of the stuff that's been said, but to go, okay, so that's important for me to understand and know and to think about carefully, not that it's a personal attack on me, but it's an opportunity to see a different point of view and to wonder and want to know more about that.
Nice. Those are great questions. Really great questions.
For me, I'm in a different situation, is that I am actually trying to understand why the people around me are saying the things that they say. And this is even before pre-COVID, and trying to get people to stop doing that, letting them know how insulting it is. When you are that person and you're saying, well, that doesn't make sense to me, or you are insulting me, it turned out to be a downright war with me and the other person, because they couldn't see how it was insulting to me when I'm trying to explain to them the reason. So that's why this question for me is a lot harder for me to answer, because I'm actually in that situation.
Yep.
And that's why I'm listening.
So what's interesting is I wonder whether a question like, what what needs to happen for you to be able to really hear me? How does that land for you?
Well, I have actually been in that situation too. Pre-COVID was a motherfucker for me. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was actually at the point of just slaughtering and killing people. We only got 59 seconds. But I am using this conversation we're holding as a way to get a tool to try to get them to start to listen to what it is that I'm saying that's insulting that they're saying to me that they think is nice things to say. Like reaching out and touching my hair, you know.
Right.
It's the little stupid things that they think are nice things, they think are cute. We need to change those dynamics so that I wouldn't reach out and touch your hair, so why would you reach out and touch mine?
Right. Right.
You know, it's that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
that's the reason why these conversations are very important to me, because I'm going to have to hold those conversations because I also have to protect my staff.
Yes. Yeah. And they're important conversations to have and to be able to have in a space where people feel free to share openly.
Well, at least with all the racial inequities, people seem to be a lot more ready to hear the conversations now than they were before.
Yeah,
that's right. Actively embeds an anti-racist approach. It's a bit jargony, but
Okay, I'm sorry, the last part, actively.
I think we're about to have everybody flood back into your room, Lisa.
Okay. I'm sorry, Liz, how can I shift? I know I heard you change, but I heard it more of the shift because you're talking about actively, right?
Yeah. Actually actively take a more, well, an active anti-racist approach.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we're all back in the main room. That was fun. We always come back too quickly.
So, Lisa, do you mind stopping sharing your screen?
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, can you see my screen, Sherry? I'm on the review and reflection slide.
I can.
All right, let's hit a home run with a couple minutes left.
So this particular module was about generative questions, and in order to catalyze conversations worth having. And just as a review, generative questions change the way people think, or they change the way you think, and they also create compelling images to move forward. I know that if your group was like my group, we didn't get anywhere near through all of the examples for how to practice this. And this really is about practicing. And so after the webinar, take a moment just to reflect on page 22. When you reflect on what you learn, it's going to deepen it. And then next slide, Jackie.
Sorry, I was typing in the chat box.
And then this week, we want you to take action on two things. One, keep staying aware of where are you? Where am I when I'm asking a question or before I ask a question? And the second one is when you're in a negative conversation or somebody says something that triggers you, pause, take a deep breath, and get curious. You can ask questions about where you are and what's going on and what's triggered you. You can also ask questions of others to help you connect. So just practice that. And as Michael said earlier, asking a generative question is not always going to be the easiest thing for us to remember how to do or know how to do. But you will learn as you practice asking questions, when you start to generate either a deeper connection with the other person or there's a shift in the way people begin thinking. You're like, oh, that was a generative question I just asked. And you'll start to learn when you can practice those more and more. So We really encourage you, if you do nothing else, where am I above and below the line? And ask generative questions whenever you're below the line.
And the only close off that I'll make is I did save the chat. We'll make sure you get the chat. The chat was really good this week. You'll get the beautiful picture you guys designed. And for Deborah Porter, these are my favorite stickies. She'll know what I'm talking about because they last for a year in a book.
Okay.
They're waterproof and all right, I told her I would show her my magic today. Anything else before we let you folks sign off? We promise we'll get you a video before the sun comes up tomorrow. We wish you a happy Canada Day and a happy 4th of July.
And we'll stick on the call if anybody has any questions.
Yeah.
Have a great week, everybody, and holler if you have any
you.
questions throughout the week.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's stick here just